Thank you. Okay, so part two is all about what is very commonly known in conspiracy circles as PID, or Paul is dead. It's all about the idea that the individual we have today presenting himself as Paul McCartney is not the original Paul. It goes a little bit deeper than that, as we'll find out. But I'm going to be examining many aspects to this theory in this section and drawing on the work of different researchers, trying to aggregate all of it and bring it all together. I'm not going to be sending you home with any definitive answer as to this whole mystery as far as I'm concerned, I'm afraid, because I'm just as confused as anyone else. You would think that the more time you spend researching this, the more crystal clear the whole thing would become. And after a few weeks of really delving into it, you could come up with a definitive answer as to what really took place. Well, that's not been my personal experience. I really can't say with any kind of certainty what went on beyond one statement, which I can make with certainty. And that statement is, there has been more than one individual presented to the public as Paul McCartney. So that's not me saying that anyone died. That's not me saying that the guy we have today, calling himself Paul McCartney, is not the original Paul McCartney. I can't be definite about any of these things, but I can be definite in saying there has been more than one Paul McCartney. That statement alone indicates high-level complicity on the part of certain parties. And it indicates that lies and deception and duplicity of the highest order have taken place. So that alone is reason enough in my book for people to be mighty pissed off at how we've been deceived and mugged off and lied to all these years. That's what motivates me to do this work. So let's examine the conventional conspiracy theory which has persisted for many, many years. The idea is that the real Paul McCartney, who came up with the Beatles from their early days of fame all the way through to 1966, died in a car crash in that year. The two dates that always come up are either September 11th of 1966, so 9/11/66, some highly occultic numbers, or November the 9th of 1966. So these are both renderings of 9/11. You tend to find that Americans like to think that it happened on the 9th of November because they prefer to put the month ahead of the date in the way they express their dates, you know. Whereas many British researchers seem to think that it happened on September 11th. So those are the two dates that we constantly get. It's kind of a myth, it's kind of a folklore thing, but there are a lot of clues and indicators that have been clearly put out there through the Beatles camp themselves to reinforce the idea that the real Paul is no longer with us. Lots of different interpretations you can put on it. Some researchers seem to think that what's being communicated is not the physical death of the real Paul McCartney, but a symbolic death, or a death of the ego, which is something you hear talked about when you get into the realms of entheogens, psychedelics. These compounds which, when they're ingested, enable you to view yourself and your part in the whole of creation from a higher perspective. And the idea of an ego death is involved in that, where you let go of your base consciousness, your base lower primal self, and you start to see things from a higher consciousness. So that's one interpretation that's put on it. The most common idea that we get is that Paul McCartney got into some kind of heated argument with the other Beatles during a recording studio session in September '66, and he jumped into his sports car and sped off through the streets of London and was involved in this horrific car crash in which he was near decapitated. Again, there's different interpretations you can put on this story. One is that it was a tragic accident that nobody could have foreseen, and that Brian Epstein and the other forces that controlled the Beatles panicked because they had no idea it was going to happen and thought, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're going to have to replace him so that the fans are none the wiser. And so they found a guy that looked sufficiently like him, performed sufficiently like him, to be able to pass him off as the new Paul McCartney. That telling of the story strikes me as slightly implausible for many reasons. The other slightly more sinister variant of it is that this was no tragic accident that just occurred on the spur of the moment, but that it was planned for. It was known to be coming. And so there was a period of preparation for the guy that came in and took over the role of Paul McCartney. Everyone knew that this was going to happen on this particular date. It gets a lot deeper than this, trust me. So this is a book that was put out by Nick Colostrom, who was mentioned in part 1, called The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. Fairly plain and straightforward what he's getting at there. And it very much draws on this official account of what happened. But the waters get sufficiently muddied. Wouldn't be much of a talk otherwise, right? This is a very interesting newspaper cutting which recently came across my radar. It dates back to 1963, and it's an account of James Paul McCartney, 21 years old, so he was born in 42, this would have been 1963, of 24th Lynn Road, Allerton, Liverpool, was fined £25 and disqualified from driving for 12 months after he admitted exceeding the speed limit along Seabank Road. That's an interesting sort of precursor for this idea of this horrific car crash in which he lost control of his vehicle and died, a few years later. This is reportedly a picture of Paul McCartney after he had a famous moped accident on Boxing Day of 1965 in the Wirral, Merseyside. So the story is, over the Christmas holidays, McCartney went out on a moped with a couple of companions, and he got involved in an accident, came off the moped and mashed up his face, particularly his lip. And these are supposed to be the injuries that were sustained. Again, some researchers think that this may have been some kind of warning to McCartney or some kind of precursor for what was known to be coming with a car accident. We can only speculate on this. One interesting aspect of it came up in an interview with a guy named Richard Balducci with Mike Williams, otherwise known as Sage of Quay. People might be familiar with Mike's research into the whole McCartney conspiracy. He's put a ton of work into this, and he's uncovered so many different elements of it. We have this guy on, Richard Balducci, who's an astrologer, an occultist, symbologist. He's a wealth of knowledge in himself. And he pointed out that from the 26th of December 1965, when this moped accident supposedly took place, to the 11th of September 66, which is the date we're given for McCartney's car crash, is precisely 260 days. And he points out that in the Mayan calendar system, going back to that civilization and that culture, 260 days was a solar year to them. That's how they measured time, in 13 groupings of 20 days. So that becomes an interesting number to factor into all of this. I've put a picture of a radio in there just to remind me to talk about this. I need these little visual stimulants, otherwise I'll forget important things. The reason I wanted to mention this is because last year I got approached by a very well-known, very prominent British record producer. I'm not going to mention this individual's name because they would prefer that I don't. But I went to see this person, and this person, note, I'm not even saying if it's male or female, this person said to me that they vividly remember in 1966 hearing a news report coming over the radio stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been involved in a car accident. It was rather like the story of World Trade Center 7, Building 7, coming down on 9/11 that got reported by Jane Stanley on the BBC in 2001. The story came out, it was heard once, and it was never repeated. And it was kind of scrubbed from the official history of the event, as if the story leaked out and it shouldn't have done, and efforts were then made to ensure that it never got out again. So this person remembers the radio report going out but never being repeated. Last year also, I got contacted by somebody from America by email, and she said to me that she remembers hearing a story coming over the radio in 1966, but in this version of events it stated that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been tragically killed in a car crash. So it went further to say that he'd actually died. And she said the story was never repeated again. So of course we've only got these people's word for it, but as far as I can make out, they've got no reason to be lying. So those are a couple of interesting things to factor into the equation. According to the official PID mythology or lore, the Beatles camp themselves communicated what had happened with the death of Paul through a whole bunch of clues and symbolic little pointers. This was encoded into the artwork of their albums, as well as into audio recordings, backmasked into some of their songs, and also in photographs from the period as well. One of the most famous ones is the sleeve to the iconic Sgt. Pepper album, released in June '67. There's supposed to be all kinds of clues pertaining to Paul's death contained in this. Certainly we can see a rendering of the early Beatles in these drab black funeral suits, looking all sad and forlorn over on the left-hand side. And then in the middle of the picture, you've got the new, vibrant, colourful Beatles ready to launch phase 2 of the career with, presumably, the new Paul in place. You'll note that he's quite a bit taller than the other Beatles, which hadn't been the case in previous photos. They're also standing around a grave, mourning the passing of the Beatles. There's all sorts of other clues in there as well, which would take all night to go through. But it was realised a while back by some very vigilant researchers that if you place a mirror across the centre of the drum, which we see in the middle of the band here, you get an interesting mirror image being created. And in the middle of it, you get the words, 1IX, he die. And between the he and the die, it appears to be an arrow, which is pointing up directly at where Paul is standing. So this is Roman numerals, and when you translate it, it becomes 9/11, 9/11, he died. So it's again suggesting that 9/11 was indeed the date when this event happened. Some people feel that this was the Beatles toying with their fans. They had a mischievous sense of humour, and they were just mocking and winding up the public, or seeing who would spot it, and how far they could get away with it. But when we factor in all the other occult aspects to this group that we discussed in part 1, it seems to me that there's a play out of this tenet of placing the truth in plain sight, or revelation of the method, which is adhered to by Freemasons and other occult secret societies, where they feel the need to communicate what it is they're doing, or have done, or are representing to us. They do it in cryptic, encoded form, so that only those that are well-versed in deciphering these kinds of symbols and clues stand a chance of understanding what's being communicated. But nevertheless, as they see it, they've discharged their responsibility by giving us the opportunity to know what went on if we have the eyes to see and the will to want to see it. That is a belief system by which these occult controllers operate. Another classic Beatles album sleeve, which is supposed to be replete with clues pertaining to Paul's death, is Abbey Road, released in 1969. The famous picture of the Beatles crossing the zebra crossing outside EMI Studios in London. Paul is out of step with the other Beatles, so his right leg is forward, all the other ones have their left leg forward. This is supposed to represent a funeral procession in terms of how this has been interpreted, with John in white representing a priest, Ringo is representing a mourner at a funeral dressed all in black, George is in denim as if he's the grave digger, and Paul in a loosely fitting suit is the corpse, and of course he's barefoot, and that's supposed to have significance as well. The Paul is Dead legend really took off in the fall, excuse the pun, of 1969 in America, when a bunch of college students really took hold of the whole thing and gave it some legs. So I've just documented this here so that I don't forget who said what when. This appears in volume 1 of my book. The first known reference to it came from a print article penned by this guy Tim Harper. It appeared in the September '69 edition of the Times Delphic, coming out of Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He claims he got the information from a fellow student named D'Artagnan Brown, who in turn got the story from a musician in California. Then there's a reference to a radio show by this DJ Russ Gibb on a Detroit station, which really popularised the whole Paul is Dead idea. This particular broadcast took place on the 12th of October 1969, and the 12th of October just happens to be the birthday of Aleister Crowley, which may or may not be important. So then, 2 days after this Russ Gibb broadcast, we had a review of the Abbey Road album in the form of this article, McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light, satirical review of Abbey Road, and it's credited to this student, Fred Laborde. He stated that he had invented many of the clues that he'd cited as pointing to McCartney's death. Despite this, however, the myth failed to go away, and Laborde's admission seems to have only fueled a huge appetite among Beatles fans to scour their record collection for further clues. So either Laborde really did invent this whole thing and it's just one big gag, or there's an attempt at damage limitation going on here, and they're trying to explain how the whole thing took place. Oh, bloody hell, this is not working. Right, this is quite annoying because I had some audio snippets here that I wanted to play you, and I had some problems bringing it into the presentation, which is very annoying. Let me just try something, because I've got another version of this and it might work in there. It's a big part of the presentation, and it would be a shame if it doesn't work. I told you I was road testing this one. Alright, it's going to work in this version. So here's a couple of audio clues that were placed into Beatles material, which researchers picked up on as apparently pertaining to Paul having died. The first one is in the play-out groove from Strawberry Fields Forever, which was released at the very start of 1967. And if you listen very closely, underneath the instrumentation, you're supposed to be able to hear John Lennon saying, "I buried Paul." Right there at the end, did you catch that? In later interviews, Lennon claimed that when he was asked about it, he said, "Oh, I wasn't saying I buried Paul, I was saying cranberry sauce." You know, like you do. And in other interviews, he claimed that he was saying, "I'm very bored." So we got three different explanations to what we're listening to there. Again, in isolation, you could dismiss it as just one of those things that doesn't really matter, but it's not in isolation because it's one of so many clues and indicators that we get. There's definitely something being communicated to us here. Here's another one.
Number nine. Number nine.
That's coming out in mono.
Number nine.
That's somebody else's graphics, not mine. Alright, so this is a classic one. This comes from the track Revolution No. 9, which is not really a piece of music at all. It's like this montage, a mishmash of sounds, very much in the avant-garde tradition of that time in the 60s. It's just a compilation of different audio elements. And at the very start of it, you've got this announcer who's saying number 9, like a studio announcer. And it was realised that if you reverse that piece of recording, it sounds very similar to Turn Me On, Dead Man. This is a clue that was highlighted to Russ Gibb on that famous radio broadcast in October '69, where students were calling up and they were saying, "Oh, I've played this track backwards. This was on the White album, released at the end of 1968. And it comes out as Turn Me On, Dead Man." So they're revealing it to you there. This is one of the major clues in this kind of mythology. Either way, we had the famous Beatles' Greatest Hits albums that came out in the 1980s. There were 2 volumes of it. The first one, 1962 to 1966, chronicling those relatively innocent years of those nice, pleasant love songs, you know, before the switch happened. And this was coloured red, and you have the 4 Beatles here in position. Then you had volume 2, covering the years 1967 to 1970. And this one was blue, as in the red and blue lodges of Freemasonry, the Scottish rite of Freemasonry. You have red and blue lodges represented in that tradition. So this could be another clue as to Masonic influences on the Beatles for those that have the eyes to see. But, to my eyes, between these two albums, McCartney's been switched. It's a different guy. So he's in the same position, but it's a different Paul. And I've got a good friend of mine who, when I started getting into this research, she told an anecdote to me of how when she was a little girl, was probably 6 or 7 years of age, something like that, she passed by a record shop, and in the window they had these two versions of the Beatles' greatest hits albums. And she looked at the two of them and thought to herself, oh, they switched one of the members. So at 6 or 7 years of age, her eyes were telling her that this is not the same guy. And yet I have conversations with grown adults who've been Beatles fans for decades, and they will swear blind that, of course not, it's the same guy. He looks exactly the same. I'm not having it. No, doesn't make any sense to me. So it seems that children, in their innocence, can pick up on things that grown adults just don't want to see in so many instances. So what happened to real Paul? This is focusing on the idea that the original Paul McCartney was taken out, in whatever circumstances, and replaced by somebody that has been playing the puppet role ever since. As I said at the start, I've got no dog in this race, in that I don't come down on any particular aspect of this whole conspiracy, other than accepting that there's been more than one Paul McCartney. You'll probably see why I've come to that position as we go forward, and the information continues to pile up. As I mentioned in part one, Paul McCartney spent many years of the 1960s with Jane Asher as his girlfriend. Here she is, daughter of the aforementioned Dr. Richard Asher, who we're going to come to, and sister of Peter Asher. So here's what many people take to be the original Paul, out with Jane in the early 60s. And you'll note that they're more or less the same height, he's just slightly taller. Then we have another picture where, in the latter days of their dating, we've got Paul, in inverted commas, with Jane, and he's towering above her. And you can see their legs, so you can see he's not standing on a box or anything like that. This is cited by many people as an indication that Paul has been switched, and these are no longer the same people. This is Peter Asher, one part Ed Sheeran, one part Austin Powers. And he's the brother of Jane. He was one part of Peter and Gordon, who had a couple of hits in the 60s, including A World Without Love, which was apparently penned by Paul McCartney, who wrote some of their songs. And he was a co-owner, or operator at least, of the Indica Gallery in London, which becomes a very interesting location in the whole Beatles story, alongside a guy called Barry Miles and John Dunbar. Is that right, mate?
Yeah.
And Paul McCartney was also involved as a business partner, I think, in that operation.
He even helped to actually put up the shelves when they were building the place.
Right.
So, and painting it and stuff like that, yeah. He was very involved.
Matt knows a shitload about this, that's why I've got him on the Bristol talk with me. So there was the Indica Gallery, which was very much a part of the avant-garde scene again of the 60s, which was kind of the British take on the counterculture that was happening in the United States at that time. This was the British expression of it. It tied in with swinging London and Carnaby Street and all these changing attitudes that were happening in London at the time. The Indica Gallery dealt with avant-garde art, and there was also a bookshop element to it as well, which dealt with occult books. It's where John Lennon is said to have been introduced to Yoko Ono by Robert Fraser, who's another art dealer that was involved in that whole scene. And it's got lots of other things to answer for as well. So there's Peter Asher, he's still alive today. Who knows what stories he's got. So their parents were Dr. Richard Asher, we're going to come to him, and the mother was Margaret Elliott. Here's her Wikipedia entry, and from it we discover that she basically comes from aristocratic stock. It's all about bloodline families in this story in so many cases, as to which of these individuals end up in prominent positions. Remember Yoko Ono that I mentioned in part one is descended from Japanese emperor ancestry. With Margaret Elliott, we find out that she was born to Honourable Edward Granville Elliot, a younger brother of both 7th and 8th Earls of St Germans. She was the great-granddaughter of Edward Granville Elliot, the 3rd Earl of St Germans, so aristocracy by any other name. She was a music teacher, and she's credited with having taught George Martin the oboe and other instruments, I think. And it was a very musical household. Paul McCartney is down in history as having spent a long period of time in the 1960s living in the Asher household, which is at 57 Wimpole Street in London. It's just round the corner from Harley Street, where all the famous clinicians are based. And Dr. Richard Asher ran his clinic from his home. McCartney is said to, for some reason, have lived there for a long period when he was dating Jane. And he's said to have written many of his famous songs in the Asher household, including the song Yesterday, arguably his most famous. Richard Asher was involved in research in different areas. He was known as an endocrinologist, I think, and a hematologist.
Oh yeah, hematologist.
Hematologist, yeah.
And the effects of the body on the mind, you know.
Right.
Yeah, psychosis,
Yeah.
stuff like that. And he also administered hypnosis as well.
That's right. The key part is that he was into hypnosis, he was into the study of deep sleep and coma type states and how people could be programmed in a deep sleep state. That seems to have been key to his work. Many researchers feel that he was doing this on behalf of aspects of British military intelligence, possibly tied into a British expression of MK Ultra that was going on at the time. So we have McCartney being pulled up in the Asher household for that time. And recently, we had the most recent video from McCartney, taken from his album Egypt Station, for a song called Who Cares? There was an article examining this video on the Vigilant Citizen website, which is a great resource for delving into the symbolism that appears routinely in pop videos and other expressions of popular culture. So Vigilant Citizen went to town on this particular video, and in it you've got McCartney playing this psychiatrist doctor type figure. There he is in his cardigan looking sort of old and scholarly. Very tellingly, he's got this spiral symbol, this black and white sigil going on next to it, which absolutely smacks of being a mind-control trigger, going back to what I was talking about earlier, where you get this expression of the duality. This is a known trigger of mind control. And indeed, this whole video seems to be all about that. So at the start of the video, you get a close-up of the badge on his office door, and he's named as Dr. Lorenz, a behavioural hypnotist and a meteorologist. This is an obvious reference to this guy, Edward N. Lorenz, who put out a book called The Essence of Chaos. And here on the cover of it, we find a monarch butterfly, which is a very familiar symbol when it comes to mind control programming. There's this aspect of MK Ultra known as monarch programming, which is absolutely endemic throughout the entertainment industry. Many musicians will appear to have been subject to this. Incredibly, in this mainstream media appraisal of this Who Cares video, they state that it's all about anti-bullying in the parlance of the times, you know. So it's just being written off as, oh, it's McCartney's statement against bullying, but there is a little more to it than that. Interestingly, in this scene from the video, you've got McCartney taken off in a car, which looks very similar to the one we're told figured in the Paul is Dead legend, where he sped off and had that horrific accident. This seems to be a little knowing nod to that whole conspiracy theory embedded in this video. Again, for those who know. Anyway, elsewhere in the video, it's not so much about anti-bullying as about trauma-based mind control programming and satanic ritual abuse. Anyone that's been to the Vigilant Citizen website and looked at some of the articles will be very familiar with the themes that are constantly being put across in music videos. And as I said earlier, you normally get these through videos from the likes of Taylor Swift and Katy Perry and Kanye West and all these types of people that have been around since the 1960s, pushing exactly the same symbolic ideas through their music videos. But here it is in the McCartney one. You've got all these expressions of trauma and dissociation from reality, the duality, the black and white thing going on again, this horrific, traumatic sort of torture stuff going on. What has all this got to do with a pop video? It's actually a deeply disturbing one. Who cares? You can watch it on YouTube. Anyway, when it comes to the song Yesterday, there is a theory among certain researchers. One of them is a guy who goes by the name of Redwell Trabant, and that's got to be an anagram. I haven't worked out what it could be an anagram of, but Redwell Trabant sounds like an anagram to me. He's got a blog site called Beatles Conspiracy, and there are many articles on there. There's one called MK Beatles in particular, and I think it dates back a few years. I think it was 2014 when I looked at it. It's 5 years old now. In it, he's advancing the idea that given that Dr. Richard Asher, whose house and medical practice Paul McCartney was staying in the 1960s, specialised in hypnosis and the study of deep sleep states and how to program subliminally people that were in those conditions. Is it possible that when it comes to the song Yesterday, this didn't actually come from the mind of Paul McCartney, but was implanted subliminally? And that the song may actually have been composed by Jane Asher's mother, who, remember, was a musicologist and a music teacher, with possible input from Dr. Asher himself and maybe other parties as well. Again, going back to the comment I made in part one about how unlikely and unfeasible it is that guys so young could be writing songs as complex as this. So in 1965, when Yesterday was put out, McCartney was barely 23 years of age. So the idea of Redwell Trabant and others is that this song may have been put into McCartney's mind when he was in some kind of induced state of hypnosis at the hands of Dr. Asher. And it may well have been an experiment to see whether this would take hold. Because McCartney, in interviews at the time, did state that he didn't know where the song came from. He said he woke up one day and it was just in his head. And he played through the melody, he tried putting it out on the piano, and initially he called it Scrambled Eggs to the tune of Yesterday, because he didn't know what to call it. And then he said, the lyrics came and the song slowly took shape. But he was very concerned in those early days that he plagiarised the song from somebody else. He wondered if it was a song that he'd heard elsewhere and that he didn't really have the rights to it. And he had to play the melody to a few of his friends to say, are you familiar with this song? Or is this one of mine? And they were all saying, no, you must have written this. So he had some doubts himself as to where that song came from. Either way, it is very key. In the same way that John Lennon will forever be associated with the song Imagine, Paul McCartney is always going to be associated with the song Yesterday. We've got a movie coming out next month. It's due for its British cinema release. It's coming from the pen of Richard Curtis, the writer, and it's directed by Danny Boyle. It features Ed Sheeran in it, and James Corden is in it as well. So it's a real establishment lovey fest. You've got OBEs and CBEs, and they're all expressions of British establishment furniture, I can't bloody stand Richard Curtis films myself, but I suppose I'll have to see this one in the name of research. So the basic premise of this song, this movie, is that you have this guy played by Himesh Patel, and he's an up-and-coming musician. One day, he gets struck by a vehicle, and he falls unconscious, and when he wakes up, he finds that he's entered some kind of parallel universe, alternate reality, where nobody else can remember the Beatles. They've been scrubbed from history. So he tries looking up the Beatles, and there's no reference to them at all. It's as if they've never existed, yet he remembers them. There's elements of the Mandela effect being expressed here, I would suggest. And so he realises this when he starts performing the song Yesterday, which he's always loved, to a bunch of friends, and they all turn around and say, that's amazing, when did you write that? And he says, well, I didn't write it, Paul McCartney did. And they all say, who? Who the hell's Paul McCartney? So there's many things that we're getting communicated here. There's the idea of plagiarism. There's the idea of a guy passing off a song as his own when it's not really his own. And and it's all centred around the song Yesterday, of all the songs it could have been. You got the idea of this sort of time slip, or this Mandela effect type parallel universe, and it's all centred around Paul McCartney, you know, which is a very interesting thing to come out at this time. Lots of references to the Paul is Dead conspiracy as well, from what I've seen of the trailer. It will be an interesting one to research. Alright, so I've got a few video snippets here. The first one is an interview that Paul did in 1964 with David Frost on British TV. And he's talking about retirement. So the Beatles only broke through in a big way towards the end of 1962, but already in 1964, when David Frost asks him what plans he's got for the future, he says he's talking about retirement, which may be a clue connected to what was to come to pass. But I'll play you the interview anyway and see what you make of it. I think the volume's a little quiet on this one. So.
I don't want to be, no, nothing like that, no. Retire. Retire. And when do you think you'll achieve that ambition? Where things will go in a couple of years. Good idea.
Interesting thing for him to have been talking about in 1964. If we assume that's the original Paul, of course, there are people that will tell you it's not. I never made the claim this was going to be clear-cut and with easy solutions. Here's Paul from the same television interview, and he just seems to feel the need to subliminally throw up the what's known as the 666 sign. Again, this goes back to my earlier suggestion that I think many of these people are programmed to do these signs because they just seem to do it without thinking, and every time they realise a camera is on them, they seem to feel the need to do it. Alright, so according to many tellings of this idea of Paul having been replaced, the individual that took on the role and has been playing it from 1966 to this present day goes by the name of William Shepherd. Sometimes you hear him expressed as William Campbell. It's worth noting that the group Marmalade, who were around in the 1960s, they had a hit with Obla Di Obla Da, which was a Lennon and McCartney song. There was a member of that group coming out of Scotland who was known as William Junior Campbell, known popularly as Junior, but his real name was William Campbell. Wings had a song called Junior's Farm in the 1970s, as an aside, but this guy was known as William Campbell, and he may well be the origin of the idea that the replacement for McCartney is somebody by the name of William Campbell. But the name we most commonly get is William Shepherd, otherwise known as Billy or Billy Shears. And Beatles fans will recall that on the Sgt. Pepper album, at the end of the first track, you get the line, "So may I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." It's as if Sgt. Pepper is a public announcement of the fact that Paul is gone, now here's the new guy, and he goes by the name of Billy Shears. There is certainly a whole wealth of evidence to suggest that the person that's being claimed to be Paul McCartney all these years actually goes by the name of Billy. And again, you could write one or two of these off as just one of those things, or a joke, or something that was misheard, but when it keeps happening, then a trend and a pattern is starting to emerge, and you have to go with it. So let's look at some examples of this individual being referred to as William or Billy in many different situations over the years.
You down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry.
Hold on, is that even it?
You down, 'cause I'm going
Yeah, this is the first one.
to Strawberry Fields. Nothing is real,
There it is.
and nothing to get hung about. Strawberry Fields forever. Always know, sometimes think it's me, but you know I know and it's a dream. I think I know me, yes, but it's all wrong. That is, I think I disagree. Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry.
Right, so that's from the video film that was produced to go with the song Strawberry Fields Forever. I'm jumping slightly ahead of myself here, I'm still finding my way with this. But the thing to take away from that is that when you get the lyric, "Nothing is real," you'll note the first time that lyric comes around, you get a close-up of Paul, suggesting that living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see, right? It's like right there in the lyrics. I did jump a little bit ahead there because I meant to mention this very important book, which is key to the whole story. It comes in 2 volumes, and it's known as the Memoirs of Billy Shears. It's credited to an author who was also known as an encoder by the name of Thomas E. U. Harriet, who comes out of Utah in the United States. And a bit of research that Mike Williams has done into this guy reveals that he was a Mormon and a Freemason. But he was a guy that was charged with putting out this book in encoded form, which purports to be the autobiography of the individual that took on the role of Paul McCartney, who goes by the name of Billy Shears. The book tells you that his real name is William Shepherd, that he comes out of a long-running family bloodline of Freemasons out of Scotland, that he's descended from William Wallace, this Scottish nobleman turned freedom fighter who was portrayed by Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. An interesting situation with dates is that from, now let me get this right, 1296 is the year that William Wallace is said to have risen up against the English occupiers of Scotland and led this rebellion against them. And in the book it reveals that from that year, 1296, to 1962, when the Beatles first broke through with Love Me Do and became a household name, is exactly 666 years. You couldn't make it up. This book comes with 666 pages, split into 66 chapters. It absolutely smacks of Freemasonry. The original retail price for it was $33, as in 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and it came with a follow-up as well. So you had the original version released on the 9th of September 2009, 999, or if you invert it, 666. These books are all about the numbers. In it, Harriet tells you, or McCartney, if that's who, Billy Shears, if that's who you believe is really writing it, tells you that numerology and expressions of 666 and the 9s are very important to understand in this whole story. Now, crucially, these books are presented as historical fiction, and they go to great lengths to explain that they are embellished with elements of fiction. So, where you're getting a certain telling of the truth of what really went on, the reader is left not knowing which parts are fictional embellishments. And the reason it had to be done that way is because if this book had come out claiming to be the absolute truth of the fact that Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter that's been playing the role ever since, the author and the publisher and everyone involved in it would be up to their necks in lawsuits and complicated legal situations to get out of. So their plausible deniability, if ever challenged on anything these books contain, is to say, well, we told you it's not historical fiction. Come on now, obviously this isn't true. But it's also a way of them communicating the truth, if you believe these are the real deal, again, in accordance with their tenet of revelation of the method. So in the original book, we got this incredible story of William Shepherd having stepped into the shoes of Paul McCartney. And he states in the book that Paul suffered these terrible premonitions, these horrific nightmares, these dreams during the time that he was living in the Asher household. And he was convinced that he was going to die. So there again, we get this idea of premonition and suggestibility and dreams, all consistent with the nature of Dr. Asher's work. And so that was the story that we got in 2009. Last year, they brought out the 9 after 909 edition. And this was released on the 9th of September 2018. So it's the 9th of the 9th, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9, so we get the 999 again. This book goes slightly further in that we get some author notes from Thomas Hugh Harriet. One of the notes states, very shockingly, that Billy underwent a program of trauma-based mind control programming from the age of 3 years old. So he was subjected to trauma which made sure that he would be programmed correctly so as to take on this public role later in life. Very consistent with other accounts that we get from the music industry of artists that are programmed from an early age, particularly those that come from family bloodlines that are deemed to be important. So there's lots of information contained in memoirs. Mike Williams of Sage of Quay has done some very detailed breakdowns of everything that's in these books. Of course, we are left not knowing which parts are fiction and which parts are truth, but if what we're looking at here is some aspect of disclosure from the McCartney Beatles camp, and some aspect of them getting off their chest what they did, and again, giving us the opportunity to know so that we can't make the claim that we were never told, then this is about as far as they can get away with without coming right out and saying that Paul was replaced and creating a very complicated situation, particularly for this guy Billy, given that he's still alive and given that he has children that are going to have to answer these questions as well. Alright, so what I've got here is a compilation of video snippets from over the years where this individual is being addressed as William or Billy. So let's take a look at these, and again, ask yourself if this number of instances could really be just one of those things, coincidence, innocent, nothing to get worried about, rather than a pattern starting to emerge. So the first one is this.
I suddenly realised that I didn't actually know how to set up a band. You think about it, I'd never actually done it before. I joined the Beatles as an already set up affair.
So there he is saying that he joined the Beatles as an already set up affair. And he didn't know how to set up a band because he'd never done it before. This conflicts with the official Beatles narrative, which is, John formed the band with Paul, and then they brought in George, and then Ringo came later. That's the way that it's all supposed to have happened. But there he is saying that he wasn't a part of setting up that original band, which would be the case if that ain't Paul.
At the beginning, when I joined, Paul was the only one who was asleep with me.
Well, there was actually a little bit of a thing to that. I was never very prejudiced. No, I thought that was the best move, really, because when you joined and you were like the new fella and nobody, and I thought, well, if I hang out with you, then they'll all be like, so I thought it'd be good to
put Paul with him.
Yes, because then it would be all right then. Yeah, it would be, because
then it changed. It would be with anybody. I mean, for a while we was with John and I didn't.
Right, so why is George referring to Paul as the new guy and him bringing him in when what's supposed to have happened is John and Paul formed the group, brought George in, then Ringo came later. George didn't come before Paul, but here he's saying that he is, indicating that, again, that ain't Paul.
Hello, how are you? Hello, George. Nice to see you.
vegetarian leather jacket.
Yeah, yes. Oh, is that a film?
Yeah,
this is what I can see. Go on, turn it off, I can see.
I don't want to turn it off.
Yeah.
I've seen that sharp, you'll see how it.
Right, so he's not too happy about being filmed on the hop there. But he quite clearly refers to him as William when he walks in. We got a lot of clues from George, actually. He walks in the room, he says, "Hello, William." It's clear as day.
You know William? Of course. Oh, great.
That's from the McCartney movie Give My Regards to Broad Street from 1984. His character in the movie is not called William, but he walks into this room and somebody says, "Oh, do you know William?" which is consistent with George having called him William when he walked in the room in the earlier one.
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
That's George when the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He attended with Ringo. Paul did not attend that event, so George, in his tribute, says, he's talking about John, and he says we all loved him very much. And then he goes on to say we all loved Paul very much. People will argue that he's saying we love Paul very much, but it certainly sounds like loved to me. I'll play it again to see what you think. And he says, you know, this is all that's left of the Beatles. It's him and Ringo. He says, this is all that's left, I'm afraid. Now, why would he say that if Paul's still alive and well?
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
I guess you could argue the case that he's saying love, so... So we get the little sly wink to the camera there. What's happened in that version of it is they've chopped up the order of talking about Beatle Ed and Beatle Bill, but either way it seems to have been important to have got that message into the film one way or the other. So it would seem to be a clue. What have we got next?
But though they may be parted, there is still a chance, Bill, that they will see.
Rare outtake from the recording of Let It Be. People have said in the studio at that time was the musician Billy Preston, who was performing with the Beatles. And so when you hear him say, there is still a chance, Bill, he might have been referring to Billy Preston, but come on now. We've got so many other Bills and Williams that that's a bit of a stretch. Have a listen again.
But though they may be parted, there is still a chance, Bill, that they will see.
Isn't that a bizarre one? Next one's good as well.
I did want to ask you, can I ask you one final question? And this is the question I was saying.
This is Denny Lane, who was in Wings with Paul McCartney.
Can I ask it? Well, okay. I'm going to go in. If you say cut this question, we'll cut it. What was it like playing with Billy Shepherd instead of fucking Paul McCartney? Billy Shepherd. I don't know. Billy Shears. Ah! Billy Shears Campbell. Thank you. That's all you're going to say, my friend. The one and only Billy Shears. Sir, it was an honor to play with you. Can I get a picture made with you? Absolutely. Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, can you cut that? Could have been here all night otherwise. You're an amazing performance. Who the hell's Billy Campbell anyway?
Denny Lane, they're both obviously very pissed, but you know, alcohol loosens tongues. And there he is, kind of confirming that it wasn't Paul McCartney, but not. So again, we've got plausible deniability here. He says, you know, who the hell is William Shepherd? It's Billy Shears. So he's kind of telling you, oh, I was just saying that he's known as Billy Shears, you know. But Denny Lane would be in a position to know. Denny Lane was in a group called the Diplomats in the early 1960s, and according to the book The Memoirs of Billy Shears, this guy, William Shepherd, was also involved in the Diplomats under the guise of Phil Ackrell, which was one of his other musician pseudonyms. So, according to this version of the story, McCartney / Billy and Denny Lane go back a long way.
It's kind of like when I met Paul McCartney. I
listen carefully to this
one. I'd never even been on Saturday Night Live. He was hanging out in Warren Michaels' house, and you know, I had the presence of mind at that moment not to go, you know, who wrote A Hard Day's Night, you know. So I said, I talked about his album 1980 and the song Tug of War, and I said, you know that lyric in the chorus, one day we'll stand up on top of the mountain with our flag unfurled, but it won't be soon enough. And he just lit up. He just lit up. Oh, that was a song, you know, I'm just putting a big flag, you know, on top of the mountain, you know. And then that was it. That was it. We were fast friends after that. So I think with Billy, people like it. If you take one of his obscure songs or obscure album and be very specific about a lyric that he wrote, people love that.
So, what the fuck? He's talking about meeting Paul McCartney, and then midway through he says, I think with Billy, so who the hell is Billy if he's talking about Paul McCartney, right? It seems to be that many people in the industry are aware that that ain't Paul McCartney, it's some guy called Billy. That's certainly what the evidence suggests. And we, the public, are the last to know. According to the book Memoirs, again, going back to that, many of the musicians of the 60s knew that Paul had been switched out. The Rolling Stones are supposed to have known. The musician Donovan is supposed to have known. Elton John is supposed to have known. Again, the public were the last to know. But, that takes some explaining away. Why would you start talking about a guy called Billy when you start an anecdote about Paul McCartney? Now, what else have I got?
What's it like to do one? It's lovely. So excuse me, I've got to say hello to my friend. Hello.
That's one that was dug up by Mike Williams, Sage of Quay. It's Olivia Harrison, George's wife, along with Danny, George's son, who's the spitting image of him. No need for a paternity test there. And so Olivia's greeting Paul, and she calls him Hello Billy. That's what it sounds like. That's only 10-2. Alright, I'll let that finish.
It's lovely. Look, excuse me, I've got to say hello to my friend.
That's finished. Okay.
Number 9.
Right, this is Heathergate.
You know why I left you? Protect me, and I will say nothing. Something so awful happened. Someone I'd known for a long time, I found out, had betrayed me immensely, and I don't mean infidelity or anything like that. Like, beyond belief.
So somebody betrayed you, and of course everyone here is going to believe that that's Paul McCartney. In a way, not infidelity. That is so much deeper than that. It wounded you and pushed you towards suicide.
Yeah, I do. And he knows that.
So it's Paul.
But I've got to protect myself. I have to protect myself. People don't want to know what the truth is because they could never ever handle it. It would be too devastating.
How long have I got, Andy? 5? 10 minutes? Jeez. Speed it up. Alright, so this is Heather, Paul's second wife, and a couple of TV interviews from 2007, talking about having discovered a terrible secret, and people could never handle it if the truth got out. She did clarify that by saying she wasn't talking about infidelity. It's not like he had an affair and she found out, it's something else. Let me speed through the rest of it then, because I want to get the really important parts in. So there is a theory that what we've been looking at all these years is not a simple switch where the original Paul exited the scene and this guy, Billy, or Paul as he's known, took over. Some researchers believe that there have been more than two, lots of different McCartneys playing the public role. This is a famous picture that's often used by Tina Foster, proprietor of Plastic Macca blog site. Now, if you showed either of those pictures to the average person and said, who is this? They would reply, well, it's Paul McCartney. But you put them side by side and you realise, there's one or two differences, shall we say. This is a compilation put together by Mike Williams. The first one is generally taken to be the original biological Paul. All the others are different individuals that have been put out there as Paul McCartney. I mean, number 5 looks like Sylvester bloody Stallone to me. But really, are we looking at the same person then? Does anyone accept that those are different photographs of the same individual? We have another montage here. Again, the first one is generally taken to be the real Paul, and the others, well, it's anybody's guess. It's not until you put the pictures side by side like this that you start to see the anomalies, because you kind of need these things pointed out to you to be able to see them. It seems that there's been a bit of toying and mockery going on in McCartney videos over the years. This is from the video to His Wonderful Christmas Time, and what we appear to have is two different Pauls. Look at the nose shape. You think it's a mirror image, but it seems to be two different ones. In the video to his song Coming Up, 1980, he plays multiple roles in the video. So he's got all these different guises. Paul did, whether you accept it's the real one or not, did like his disguises. He often dressed up. In the Pipes of Peace video, he plays both a British and a German soldier in World War I, dressing up again. It's this idea of alternate personalities. In the video to Spies Like Us, as in, spies like us, he's wearing this Prince Charles face mask and he rips it off to reveal that it's McCartney. I put this one out there to highlight the differences between two of the McCartneys. Let's do a show of hands. Is there anyone who accepts that the person on the top left can possibly be the same person as top right? And those dates are correct, by the way. There's 4 months between them, so that beard would have had to have been grown in the space of 4 months. Is there anyone that accepts that could be the same person? Okay, there's two. There's two then. I don't accept that at all. That's two completely different individuals as far as I'm concerned. I'll speed through this lot because I do want to get the latter section. Here's two pictures, though, of what is supposed to be Paul alongside Ringo. You'll note that in the first one, that's supposed to be biological Paul, the original. There he is standing back to back with Ringo, and there's a latter-day Paul with Ringo, and there's a discrepancy in the heights. There's always been a discrepancy in heights, actually. This is from an official Beatles magazine in the 1960s, and it lists all the statistics related to each of the Beatles, and it's got John, Paul, and George each listed as having been 5 foot 11 inches, and Ringo listed as shorter than the other three at 5'8". That was the official word on it back then. There is a theory that what we've been looking at all these years is twins. There's a researcher named Miles Mathis who is of this opinion, and he believes that Paul was one of fraternal twins. And they've been stepping into the role in and out all these years. That's why we're so confused and confounded, because sometimes we're looking at one of the twins and sometimes one of the others. So there's a picture that he's put in an article of his that you can get online, which purports to be the two boys as twins. That's his article there. There was an album that McCartney put out called Twin Freaks, interestingly, in the 1990s, which may or may not have some bearing on it. That's Paul's parents with what purports to be the two boys. Of course, the official account of things is that Paul has a brother called Mike, who's not a twin, but they're just, straight brothers. So that's what these pictures are supposed to be. That's Paul with Mike, his official brother. But Miles Mathis and others believe that Mike is actually a hired actor who's been put up to the role. I mean, it sounds like a stretch, but if you're going to accept that Paul McCartney was replaced, then this doesn't sound too outrageous, right? Another way of looking at things is the idea that the real Paul has actually always been around. He didn't die, and according to some researchers, he didn't even go off the scene. And these people cite different pictures of Paul from decades apart and will claim that they're the same person. So this was sent in by a Facebook friend of mine. I don't think she wants her name put out there, so I won't. But she sent me a whole load of pictures, and she's claiming that this is the same individual, so it's always been Paul. I mentioned that I would be covering all different aspects of the story here. So that's her claim. And she's included this compilation of interviews from the 1960s and then more recently where he's striking a very similar pose, as if it's a subconscious mannerism that's just playing out decades apart. And then this is just a take on the whole situation that I've come up with myself. Not saying that I necessarily believe this to be the case, just that it could be. And I'm trying to be a completist with all of this. I'm trying to give people all the possible options so that you can be as confused as I can. As I am. And you can ponder over this and lose sleep the same way I have. Okay. The idea that the person we think of as real Paul is actually the one that was introduced for a period and is the real imposter in this piece. Okay? So this is the individual that most people will say is biological Paul McCartney. This is from a 1966 television interview. There's another still from that particular interview. Now the first picture here dates back to 1960, and it's from the Hamburg years. reportedly taken by a German photographer called Astrid Kircher, who did this famous photo shoot involving Lennon and McCartney in Hamburg. So this is a very young McCartney. In the first picture there, that to me looks more like a young version of the individual we think of today as Paul McCartney and the one that we've seen for the most part in the public role. Now when you put them side by side, the guy on the right looks nothing like him. Again, is there anyone that would say that's the same person, or could possibly be the same person? No. Okay, so we're all agreed that's different individuals, right? So then, we have a problem. How do we square this with the official story that there's only ever been one Paul McCartney? Suddenly the guy on the right starts to look not so much like Paul McCartney, but the one on the left would appear to be the original guy. So maybe he's the one we've still got, and there was a period where the guy on the right stepped into the role and came to be thought of as the original biological Paul McCartney, but actually was not. Here's another compare and contrast. That's the 1964 David Frost interview and one from 2 years later in '66. Again, I would suggest that's two different people. Nobody said this was easy. John Halliday, we ain't got time for it. Latter-day Paul. One final clue may well be in his artwork that was put out at the start of this year to advertise his new album and new tour. We got these two renderings of Paul put out in the official artwork to accompany the album. Could that be another slight clue, I wonder? And then we had this article from earlier in the year where he makes the statement, I was one of the Beatles. Can you believe it? Well, can you? So what we've got there is a whole load of conflicting accounts of what may or may not have taken place when it comes to McCartney. As I said at the start, the consistent point with all of these different takes on it is that there's been more than one individual playing that public role. I hope I've been able to make you see that this evening. That alone is a conspiracy in itself. That alone is evidence of duplicity and deception of the highest order. That indicates the complicity of military intelligence, given that McCartney was knighted by the Queen, and anyone that comes into contact with members of the royal family are supposedly vetted by MI5, and their backgrounds are looked into and all of this. So if this really had been a stunt that was cooked up by Brian Epstein and a small, close circle connected to the Beatles, it would have been rumbled at some point by now if it hadn't been officially endorsed by the establishment. Clearly it has, and it ties in with the social engineering, the mind control, the evidence of military intelligence and dark occult dabblings in all these aspects of popular culture that we see time and time again. And the situation with the Beatles and McCartney are a microcosm of what goes on in society generally. Deception is everywhere, diversion is everywhere, all these different elements are in every possible strand of organised society. We've just looked at the way it plays out in entertainment this evening. So I think that's reason enough to be concerned. I think that's reason enough to be pissed off that this has happened. And I think it's reason enough to be vigilant and alert as to other ways in which these dynamics have played out. People often say when it comes to the McCartney thing, what does it really matter? So what if he was replaced? The music's still good. I fail to comprehend how someone could just dismiss this as one of those things that doesn't matter. It matters to me because it speaks so much about how we're mind controlled every step of the way. I usually finish on some Paul-related memes that I've made up. So this one makes sense in America, you can show this in the US because people know this. This one doesn't really make too much sense in the States because they haven't heard the Foley Towers thing, but it goes down well in Britain. Sometimes. And then there's this one. Makes no sense in America, but Brits seem to get it, of a certain age. That's pretty much it. I just want to mention that aspects of the Beatles story and the McCartney situation are in both volumes of my book. At huge length in volume 1, and there's a follow-up chapter in volume 2. I've got copies of both of those here, if anyone's interested. I usually open things up to questions, but I'm not sure if we've got time. Probably not.
Squeeze one.
precious one.
Yeah.
Like, I know someone's got a copy of Billy Shears out there, like there's a few people that like read the books and got like, so I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll finish, we'll give you a round of applause and like celebrate the brilliant talk. And then we've got like 15 to 20 minutes packed away where people can accost you.
Should we do one public question and then people can come up to speak? Yeah, all right. Okay. So, let's have one question. The gentleman over there.
Was the first McCartney left-hand or right-handed?
Yeah, good question. The original Paul is on record as having been left-handed. According to the memoirs of Billy Shears, the guy that came in to replace him had to train himself to play the bass left-handed because he was naturally right-handed. So the book goes to some length to explain that he had to become proficient at playing both right and left-handed so as not to be found out. So, you know, people can make of that what they will, but yeah, the original Paul is supposed to be left-handed. There are photographs of Paul, in inverted commas, after the replacement is supposed to have taken place, holding cigarettes and coffee cups and things with his right hand, whereas a left-handed person would presumably be holding them with their left hand.
What about Stephen Dickinson? You got any comments about him?
Yeah, I have.
Well, it's in litigation and they're waiting on a comment, but surely you can repeat what he's repeated.
Well, very quickly, Stephen Dickinson is this guy in Liverpool who claims he's a son of the original Paul McCartney, an illegitimate son.
What would a 7-year-old have an emphatic account about his mum coming out and saying, "It's all right, John, I told him otherwise"?
Yeah, well, I personally don't buy the Stephen Dickinson account. I personally don't buy his claims. No.
You don't buy it?
No, I don't think there's any validity to it. Don't really have time to get into it now, but to me that's a false lead, a red herring.
That's the Masonic, well, what, John Lennon didn't have his green card so he couldn't get into him?
Yeah, there's all kinds of aspects to it, but I don't buy it myself.
You don't buy it?
No, I don't buy it.
Why would
So,
somebody's psychology now...
well, it's a deep and complex one, and we ain't got time tonight, but I don't buy it. Anyway, thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you very much. To Jeremy Kyle.
Yeah, but I've still got a job.
Oh, Jesus, what an awful insult.
Maybe so, but it's true. Ta-ta.
The chats, we're going to have to lock down in about 20 minutes because the local...
Which one? The one up into him now?
The local bar.
Is he the one who was doing it?
It's been full. So we're going to be here for about 20 minutes if you want to speak to the bar. We've got brilliant talk. Sorted. Back to you in a couple of weeks. We live in a Bible university. It don't fucking matter anyway. Thank you. Come again.
Where's the shit of ran through?
Who said that?
He's wearing his Rich Palliot t-shirt.
Who is he?